2 minutes ago, the Prime Minister of Canada did something no Canadian leader has done in modern diplomatic history. Mark Carney refused to take a phone call from the President of the United States. Not delayed it, not rescheduled it, refused it. And right now, sources close to the White House say there is genuine confusion, even panic about what this means for the single most important bilateral trade relationship on planet Earth. A relationship worth $923 billion a year. But here's the part no one in mainstream media is connecting for you. This refusal is not about trade. It is not about tariffs. It is not even about Canada. However, what you have been told that the United States holds all the leverage in this relationship is a lie that has been carefully constructed over 13 months of escalation. The data is clear. The country that should be panicking is not Ottawa. It is Washington. And here is the question that will haunt you for the rest of this video. The one nobody on cable news will answer for you. If Carney's refusal was actually coordinated with two other world leaders before it ever happened, then who told him to do it? And what are all three of them about to announce? Stay with me, because by the end you will have the answer. Let me take you beneath the surface, because what happened with Carr's refusal is not a single isolated event. It is the visible tip of a three-pronged geopolitical shift that will reshape your life, whether you live in Toronto, Texas, or Tokyo. And to understand why, you need to see the three hidden connections that nobody is talking about. The first connection runs through the Strait of Hormuz. On February 28th, just 5 days ago, the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities in an operation the Pentagon named Epic Fury. Within 72 hours, Iran began threatening to blockade the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply flows every single day. Oil prices surged more than 8%. The S&P 500 dropped almost 1% on March 3rd alone, and the VIX volatility index spiked to 27. Global markets entered what Reuters called the most dangerous energy shock since the 1973 oil embargo. Now, here's the connection they do not want you to make. Canada is the single largest supplier of foreign oil to the United States. In May of 2025, Canada exported more seaborne crude to China than to America for the first time in history. That is not a typo. For the first time ever, Canadian oil flowed east instead of south. And in January of 2026, Trump threatened 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods if Ottawa moved closer to Beijing on trade. Carney called the threat bluster. Then he signed a limited trade deal with China anyway. Reduced tariffs on canola seeds going east. Reduced tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles coming in. Stop and ask yourself this. If the Strait of Hormuz partially closes because of this war, and that is now a real possibility, who does America turn to for emergency energy supply? The same country whose phone call they just had rejected. That is not a coincidence. That is leverage that did not exist 6 months ago. The second connection leads to a courtroom. On February 20th of this year, the United States Supreme Court ruled in Learning Resources Incorporated versus Trump that the emergency tariffs imposed under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act were unconstitutional. The court struck down the sweeping tariffs that had been the backbone of Trump's trade war since February of 2025. In response, the White House scrambled to impose a temporary 10% global tariff. But here is the detail buried in paragraph 37 of the ruling. COSMA-compliant Canadian goods were largely exempted. That means the legal foundation that America used to bully Canada for 13 months just crumbled. Carney knows this. The White House knows Carney knows this. And now you know it too. The third connection is the one that should genuinely frighten the administration. On February 12th, media reports confirmed that Canada is leading discussions between the European Union and the 12-nation Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTP, to create a mega trade alliance. Politico reported that Carney offered to broker a bridge between the EU and the Indo-Pacific bloc, a combined economic zone that would dwarf the American market. If this alliance materializes, it would represent the largest non-American trade network in modern history. And that brings us back to the master loop, the question still hanging in the air. Was Carney's refusal of Trump's call coordinated with the very leaders building this alliance? Because if it was, this is not a snub. This is a signal. And the next section will show you exactly who is sending it. Let me show you the chessboard. Because what you see on the surface, a Canadian Prime Minister ignoring a phone call, is a carefully calculated move in a game that involves at least 5 major power players, each with a motive they will never publicly admit. Start with Carney himself. 2 days ago on March 4th, he was in Sydney, Australia at the Lodi Institute, openly discussing how he manages Donald Trump. His exact words were, quote, respect but not obsequiousness. He told the audience that Trump is quite different in private, that the president solicits opinions and is open to hearing ideas. But then Carney said something far more revealing. He said, quote, you do not want to say anything in public that you cannot back up. Read that again carefully. A man who refused the most powerful person's phone call is telling you he never bluffs. He backs up every word. That is not the language of defiance. That is the language of someone who has already calculated every possible response. Now look at what Carney was doing in Australia in the first place. He was not on vacation. He was on what the Canadian press has called an Indo-Pacific tour, deepening ties with a nation that is also a CPTP member, also grappling with American tariff pressure and also exploring alternatives to American economic dependence. The Australian Broadcasting Corporation reported that Carney warned both nations face subordination by superpowers like the United States and China. He used the word sovereignty. When a former governor of the Bank of England and a former governor of the Bank of Canada uses that word, he is not speaking loosely. He is building a coalition. Here is the pattern interrupt you need to hear. Did you know that foreign direct investment into Canada totaled $96.8 billion in 2025? That is the highest annual inflow since 2007. According to Bloomberg News and TD Economics, American investment alone was $52.5 billion. Companies are not pulling out of Canada because of the trade war they are pouring in. That single statistic demolishes the narrative that Canada is being crushed. Now turn to the White House. U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer stated publicly in late February that, quote, any deal with Canada will include tariffs. That is not a negotiating position. That is a confession. The administration knows its legal authority was gutted by the Supreme Court ruling, and it is trying to normalize permanent tariffs before the USMCA review deadline of July 1st. Under the USMCA review clause, all 3 nations, the United States, Mexico, and Canada must decide by that date whether to extend the agreement for 16 years, revise it, or exit entirely. Oxford Economics gives a 50% probability that the deal gets renegotiated promptly. But there is also a real scenario where America walks away from the table, blowing up a trade framework that underpins the automobile industry, the energy sector, and the agricultural supply chain of all 3 nations. Then there is the Pentagon, which operates in a dimension most political commentators pretend does not exist. In March of 2025, Canada began investigating alternatives to purchasing American-made Lockheed Martin F-35 fighter jets. By March of 2026, with Carney now backing the United States' strikes on Iran, a position he said came with regret and was not a blank check, Canada holds a unique card. It is the only G7 ally that publicly supported the strikes while simultaneously building a trade alliance to counter American economic dominance. That duality gives Carney something no other world leader currently possesses: the ability to demand concessions on trade by leveraging security cooperation on Iran. Remember the unanswered question: who coordinated with Carney before the refusal? Consider this. The EU is putting pressure on its laggard members to ratify the CETA trade pact with Canada, a deal originally signed in 2017 that 10 member states still have not ratified. The timing of that push is not accidental, and the economic fallout you are about to see will show you exactly why this matters to your household. Now, let me make this personal because everything I have described so far might sound like it is happening on some distant geopolitical stage. It is not. It is happening in your gas tank, in your grocery store, and in your retirement account right now. Let us start with energy. Oil prices surged 7% in a single day after the Iran strikes on February 28th. Brent crude jumped above $80 a barrel, and the BBC reported that some analysts warned prices could breach $100 if the conflict becomes prolonged and the Strait of Hormuz is disrupted. The Guardian reported that household energy bills in the United Kingdom alone could climb by £160 a year, roughly $210 from this summer. For American and Canadian consumers, the picture is just as bleak. Gas prices at the pump are already climbing. If you filled up your car last week, you paid more than you did 2 weeks ago, and you will pay more next week than you did today. Now, here's the data that should make you sit down. The Tax Foundation calculates that Trump's combined tariffs already represent an average tax increase of $700 per American household per year. The Peterson Institute for International Economics puts it even higher, over $1,200 annually. That is not a theoretical number. That is money coming out of your checking account in the form of higher prices on vehicles, food, building materials, and consumer goods. And those numbers were calculated before the Iran war sent energy costs spiraling. The automobile industry alone tells you everything. In the summer of 2025, U.S. tariffs on Canadian vehicles caused the portion of Canadian-made cars that could enter the United States without tariffs to plummet from nearly all exports to barely one-third. The leading American auto industry lobbyist told Trump directly that vehicle prices could rise as much as 25% almost immediately. If you are planning to buy a car this year, you are not just facing higher sticker prices. You are facing higher insurance premiums because those are now tied to the replacement cost of tariff components. Food prices tell the same story, but from a different angle. Canada and Mexico are the two largest agricultural trading partners of the United States. 20% of American agricultural sales are export dependent. And the American Farm Bureau Federation's chief economist warned as far back as December 2024 that tariffs would backfire on American farmers. Here is the number that no one is reporting. Since Canada began diversifying its exports away from the United States, its trade deficit with America has narrowed dramatically. In March of 2025, it dropped to just 56 million Canadian dollars, and exports to countries other than the United States surged 24.8%. Canada is finding new buyers. American farmers are losing their biggest customer. And if you think your retirement savings are safe, think again. The S&P 500 has now fallen negative for the year as of March 3rd. The index dropped 0.9% in a single day on Iran war fears, following a year in which it had already lost $4.5 trillion in value during the tariff-induced sell-off of 2025. Morgan Stanley warned this week that a prolonged Iran conflict could lead to higher oil prices, hotter inflation, and greater market uncertainty. If you have a 401k, you're watching this happen in real time. Here is what connects all of this back to the refused phone call. Carney is not just saying no to Trump. He is saying, I have other options. Canada's economy contracted briefly in early 2025, but avoided recession entirely. Unemployment unexpectedly fell to 6.9% by June, and the federal government announced a plan in January 2026 to expand trade with non-U.S. countries by up to $1 trillion over 5 years. What they told you that Canada cannot survive without America was a lie. And what happens next in the next 30 days will prove it. Here is exactly what the data says will happen over the next 4 weeks. And I am assigning probabilities so you can judge for yourself. In week 1, from March 5th through March 12th, there is a 75% probability that White House officials attempt to downplay the significance of Carney's refusal while simultaneously back-channeling through diplomatic staff to reestablish direct communication. The Iran conflict will continue to dominate headlines, and oil prices will remain elevated between $78 and $85 per barrel for Brent crude. Expect the S&P 500 to remain volatile, fluctuating within a 2 to 3% band as traders price in the dual shock of war and trade uncertainty. In week 2, from March 12th through March 19th, there is a 65% probability that Canada announces a new bilateral economic initiative with at least one CPTP or EU member nation, likely Australia or Japan. Time to coincide with Carney's return from the Indo-Pacific tour. This will be framed as economic diversification, but the real message will be aimed squarely at Washington. The clock is ticking before July 1st and the USMCA review. In week 3, from March 19th through March 26th, there is a 60% probability that Trump responds with a public escalation, either a new tariff threat or an aggressive Truth Social post targeting Carney personally. The October 2025 playbook, when Trump terminated trade talks over Ontario Premier Doug Ford's anti-tariff ad campaign, is the template here. Expect the rhetoric to heat up dramatically. In week 4, from March 26th through April 2nd, there is a 55% probability that both sides quietly agree to resume formal trade discussions ahead of the July 1st USMCA deadline, likely with preconditions from both sides. But here is the wild card nobody is accounting for. If the Iran war escalates further and the Strait of Hormuz is even partially disrupted, the energy equation changes everything, and America's need for Canadian oil and gas will force concessions that were unthinkable 3 months ago. And here is the final pattern interrupt before we close. The University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index is near historic lows. It hit 50.88 in April of 2025, the second lowest reading since records began in 1952. Consumer confidence is cratering not because of one crisis, but because of the compounding effect of tariffs, war, and uncertainty happening simultaneously. That is not a cycle. That is a spiral. Now, let me answer the question I planted at the very beginning, the one that has been running underneath every section of this video. Was Carney's refusal of Trump's call coordinated with other world leaders before it happened? Here is the answer. The evidence points to yes. In the days leading up to the refusal, Carney was on an official visit to Australia, a CPTP member nation whose prime minister shares his strategic concern about subordination by superpowers. Before that, in February, Canada was confirmed to be leading discussions with the European Union on bridging the CPTP and the EU into a unified trade framework. Politico Europe reported Carney explicitly offered to broker this bridge. He did this while the White House was still reeling from the Supreme Court ruling that destroyed the legal basis of its emergency tariffs. The refused phone call was not an emotional reaction. It was the opening move in a new phase of negotiations. A deliberate signal to Washington, Brussels, Canberra, and Tokyo that Canada will not negotiate from a position of weakness and that the era of quiet compliance is finished. The true cost of what you just learned comes down to this single devastating truth. The United States started a trade war 13 months ago, believing it held all the leverage. That Canada, dependent on American markets for 80% of its exports, would fold within weeks. Instead, Canada diversified its trade, attracted $96.8 billion in foreign investment, built the architecture of a mega trade alliance spanning the EU and the Indo-Pacific, survived a Supreme Court ruling that gutted American tariff authority, and is now watching the Iran war handed an energy card worth more than any tariff threat ever could. The country that refused the phone call is not the country in panic mode. And every dollar you spend on gas, groceries, and goods this month will remind you of that. Earlier in this video, I showed you how the Supreme Court's Learning Resources ruling dismantled the legal framework for emergency tariffs. That ruling is only the beginning of a judicial chain reaction that will reshape American trade policy for a generation. The next video you need to watch explains exactly how that Supreme Court decision connects to the July 1st USMCA deadline and why what happens in that courtroom will determine the price you pay for everything from your morning coffee to your car insurance for the next 16 years. Watch it now because what happens there will make everything in this video make sense.